Hi everyone, and welcome to History Discussion, your weekly deep dive into some of the most dramatic moments in American and Vietnamese history. I'm glad you're here. In his inauguration speech, President Obama mentioned Khe Sanh as a symbol of the sacrifice and bloodshed our army faced on the battlefields of Vietnam. This single battle drew more media attention than almost any other conflict during the war. Global headlines devoted up to 50% of their front pages to it. Even President Lyndon Johnson had a huge diorama of Khe Sanh built inside the White House to keep tabs on the fighting. If that doesn't tell you how pivotal this battle was for both America and Vietnam in 1968, I don't know what does. But before we jump into why the Battle of Khe Sanh shook the world that year, we have to go back and ask, why were American troops even in South Vietnam after the shocking defeat at Dien Bien Phu? It all goes back to the negotiations that followed General Von Nguyen Giap's victory at Dien Bien Phu. Both sides sat down at the Geneva Conference and agreed to a temporary division of the country along the 17th parallel. Not as a permanent border, but just until national elections could reunify Vietnam in July 1956. There was even a clause that allowed people to move freely between the North and the South for 300 days. What was the real significance of this? Why was free movement so important that it was written into the Geneva Accords? Well, first, it was propaganda, meant to show the world that most Northerners wanted to escape communism. But more deeply, it gave the US and the South a chance to import skilled, loyal anti-communist cadres, people who could help hold the line against the North. So why did so many people leave the North for the South? By most estimates, out of 1.3 million total migrants, about 1 million went from north to south, while only 300,000 went in the other direction. The vast majority of those moving south were Catholic. Catholic priests and church leaders encouraged their followers to relocate, believing that Ngo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam's new prime minister, and himself a Catholic, would give them land and security in the south. The US used psychological warfare, spreading rumors that the North would soon persecute Catholics, and that even the Virgin Mary herself had left the North. Of course, the planned nationwide elections never happened. President Ho Chi Minh saw it coming. He warned that after Dien Bien Phu, foreign powers funding 80% of the French war effort would never let Vietnam be unified without a fight. And he was right. The US propped up the Diem regime, a government so undemocratic that Diem won 98.2% of the vote in an election where there were more ballots cast in Saigon than registered voters. American analysts at the time admitted that if true elections were held, Ho Chi Minh would have swept at least 80% of the vote. The real reason the Geneva Accords were tossed aside? Washington feared that if Vietnam was unified under communism, it would trigger a domino effect across all of Southeast Asia. That's why, instead of elections, the 17th parallel became the dividing line in a new Cold War. But America's fears about the domino effect didn't just influence policy. They shaped everything about our approach in Vietnam. Our leaders, convinced that if Vietnam fell, communism would sweep across Laos, Cambodia, and maybe even further, invested billions and threw the weight of 5 different presidential administrations behind the effort to stop it. That's why we backed Ngo Dinh Diem so heavily, even as his regime grew increasingly corrupt and repressive. Diem's 98.2% election victory, where votes outnumbered voters in Saigon by over 200,000, became a symbol of just how far things had drifted from the promise of democracy. American journalists and diplomats were well aware of the fraud, but with so much at stake, Washington chose to look the other way. And in the background, the North, under Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, kept building their legitimacy and popularity, especially after their stunning victory at Dien Bien Phu. American intelligence concluded that if free elections were ever held, Ho Chi Minh would win by a landslide. This wasn't just propaganda. It was the sober assessment of our own experts at the time. So the elections were scrapped, the 17th parallel became a fortified frontier, and the conflict hardened into a full-blown war of ideology, with both sides seeing themselves as the true representatives of the Vietnamese people. From there, U.S. strategy kept evolving in an attempt to win in Vietnam. We went from special warfare with advisors and financial support to limited war with direct military engagement, and finally to Vietnamization, handing more responsibility to the South Vietnamese army as we tried to extricate ourselves. Each new American administration tried a different approach, and each met the same fate: frustration, stalemate, and ultimately, failure. It's worth remembering that some of the smartest military minds in America, strategists, generals, and policymakers, spent years trying to find a path to victory. But the realities on the ground in Vietnam were unlike anything the U.S. had ever faced before. The North's resilience, the Southern insurgency's ability to blend with the local population, and the sheer complexity of Vietnamese society made every American strategy fall short. As we've seen, every move by the United States, political, military, psychological, was met with a response that was often smarter, more flexible, and more deeply rooted in the lived experience of the Vietnamese people. The result was a conflict that dragged on, costing enormous sums of money, lives, and global credibility. So, after 5 presidents, countless strategies, and immense sacrifice on both sides, America was forced to confront a tough truth. Vietnam wasn't just another battlefield. It was a test of will, identity, and the limits of American power. We begin in early 1961 when the U.S. began pouring advisors, weapons, and aid into South Vietnam to bolster the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. The goal: to build so-called strategic hamlets, modeled after successful Philippine counterinsurgency efforts. But these hamlets failed. Vietnamese peasants were reluctant to abandon their ancestral villages and daily traditions, turning those protected settlements into virtual open-air prisons rather than thriving communities. That misstep eventually forced the U.S. to transition from strategic hamlets to full-scale conventional warfare. On March 8, 1965, American troops started landing in Gia Nang. Over the next few years, U.S. troop levels swelled to nearly 1 million, including Allied contributions. By contrast, ARVN forces numbered around 200,000, with far less equipment and training. Facing such disparity, President Le Duan and North Vietnamese strategy emphasized a war of endurance, forced the U.S. to fight a long war until domestic pressures eroded American resolve. By late 1967, U.S. commanders were concerned about a potential repeat of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. General Westmoreland believed that Khe Sanh combat base, established near the Laos border as early as 1962, could serve as a vital strategic point, both to watch PAVN movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and to anchor U.S. defenses south of the DMZ. Starting January 21, 1968, North Vietnamese forces, estimated at 2 to 4 divisions, laid siege to Khe Sanh, closing Route 9 and disrupting U.S. supply lines. This coincided with North Vietnam's broader Tet Offensive, which detonated across South Vietnam's cities simultaneously. Historians debate whether the siege was meant as a real attempt to seize Khe Sanh or a diversion to draw U.S. forces away from urban centers. Under intense bombardment, the base's defenders, 6,000 Marines supplemented by ARVN and U.S. Army units, relied heavily on air power. Operation Niagara launched the largest sustained bombardment in history, with nearly 40,000 tons of bombs dropped between January and April, while Marine and Air Force aviation flew over 16,000 sorties themselves. The base was never completely cut off thanks to the innovative use of helicopters and LAPS low-altitude parachute delivery from C-130s. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese kept up artillery and mortar assaults on outposts like Hill 861 and the Lang Vây Special Forces Camp, taking several positions, though never overrunning the main base. In mid-March, U.S. launched Operation Pegasus, an overland relief that cleared Route 9 and lifted the siege by April 8th. In the immediate aftermath, U.S. forces declared Khe Sanh a tactical success and evacuated the base. By June 19th, the base was dismantled. Final withdrawal occurred on July 5, 1968. North Vietnamese claimed a political victory. They drew away a large share of U.S. troops during Tet and exposed the unsustainability of America's war strategy. Strategic analysts have argued that Khe Sanh functioned as a diversion, By fixing U.S. forces to the border region, it allowed the VC to strike in urban centers more successfully. In effect, General Giap used Khe Sanh as a strategic distraction, or what's known as an option play. The U.S. responded with massive firepower and held the base, but at the cost of overlooking the bigger Tet campaign unfolding in cities like Saigon and Hue. Picking up where we left off, let's examine the aftermath of the Battle of Khe Sanh and its impact on both American and Vietnamese strategy, and how it still shapes the way we think about the Vietnam War today. After the siege ended in April 1968, U.S. military leaders initially hailed the defense of Khe Sanh as a victory. General Westmoreland and his staff emphasized that, despite being heavily outnumbered, American and ARVN forces had held the base under intense bombardment, inflicted significant casualties, and never allowed the North Vietnamese to capture it. For a moment, it seemed like a demonstration of U.S. resolve and the effectiveness of air power and logistics in the face of adversity. However, that tactical success didn't translate to a clear strategic win. In fact, by July 1968, just a few months after the siege was lifted, U.S. forces abandoned and destroyed the Khe Sanh combat base. The official reason was that its strategic value had diminished and that holding it required too many resources, especially as North Vietnamese forces could simply shift their operations elsewhere. But the withdrawal raised tough questions for the American public and policymakers. After investing so much blood and treasure, why give it up? Was it really worth it? Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese leaders and General Giap, looking back on the campaign, viewed Khe Sanh not as a loss, but as a critical element of their overall Tet Offensive strategy. By drawing U.S. troops and attention to Khe Sanh, they managed to divert resources away from urban centers, where simultaneous attacks shocked both South Vietnam and America. The attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, symbolically considered the White House of the East, made international headlines, even though the attackers were quickly repelled. For many Americans watching on television, it created a perception that the enemy could strike anywhere, anytime, despite years of U.S. involvement. Inside the United States, the impact was profound. The Tet Offensive and the Khe Sanh episode within it shattered the illusion that the war was nearing a successful end. The American media broadcast dramatic footage and raised tough questions. If the enemy could launch such coordinated attacks, and if our bases, even a heavily fortified one like Khe Sanh, were vulnerable, then what was the endgame? President Johnson's administration faced growing anti-war sentiment, and public confidence in official reports began to erode. Strategically, the events of 1968 forced a major shift in American policy. Johnson halted the bombing of North Vietnam and announced he would not seek re-election. The Vietnamization policy was accelerated, aiming to hand more responsibility to the South Vietnamese army while gradually reducing U.S. troop involvement. Yet, the psychological effect of Khe Sanh and Tet was lasting. They revealed the limits of American military power in an environment where political will, not just firepower, would decide the outcome. For the North Vietnamese, the 1968 campaigns achieved several goals. They demonstrated to their own people and to the world that they could challenge U.S. power, disrupted American strategy, and ultimately pushed the U.S. closer to negotiation and withdrawal. Although North Vietnam also paid a high price in casualties, the political victory was undeniable. America was no longer confident in victory, and that changed everything. As we look back on Khe Sanh, historians now see it as more than just a siege. It was a symbol of the Vietnam War's contradictions: overwhelming American technology versus Vietnamese determination, battlefield victories that didn't lead to strategic success, and a war that, ultimately, was decided as much by politics and will as by guns and bombs. So here's the question. In the end, did the United States and its allies really understand the true nature of the conflict they were fighting? And how did Vietnamese strategy continue to evolve after Khe Sanh in ways that kept surprising American commanders? Top U.S. intelligence leaders, 4-star General Westmoreland and CIA Chief Philip Davidson, predicted that Vietnamese forces would attack either before or after Tet, but never during. They assumed the Viet Cong lacked the strength to strike the cities, and instead would focus on places like Khe Sanh. And so, at the time, Many South Vietnamese army units were sent home to celebrate Tet in their villages, while U.S. officers and soldiers were allowed to participate in the Vietnamese Lunar New Year traditions. Even President Nguyen Van Thieu of South Vietnam went to his wife's hometown in the U.S., adding to the complacency in the military circles. But then, on January 21, 1968, just 10 days before the main offensive, Vietnamese forces fired the first gunshots at Khe Sanh in a feint maneuver. That was also the first time they brought tanks into play there, making the U.S. even more convinced that the Viet Cong would limit their attack to Khe Sanh only. Intelligence reports claiming attacks in urban areas were dismissed as false. That led to the assumption that the war would be conventional, with a single front at Khe Sanh, and the U.S. was fully prepared for it. The U.S. believed that with superior training, logistics, and firepower, they would easily defeat North Vietnamese conventional forces. They even provoked North Vietnam to attack Khe Sanh, confident they would crush them. In U.S. thinking, Khe Sanh was like a second Dien Bien Phu, a trap for a conventional showdown. Compared to the French in Dien Bien Phu, who could only airdrop about 100 tons of supplies per day, the U.S. could sustain 600 tons of supplies daily to Khe Sanh via helicopters and aircraft. So they felt unconcerned. In the first 10 days of fighting, they fired 150,000 artillery rounds, 1.5 times what the French used over 56 days at Dien Bien Phu. They even flew in the newly trained 1st Air Cavalry Division within 72 hours. And their iconic B-52 bombers rained down 100,000 tons of bombs over Khe Sanh. From the American viewpoint, this was dominance. B-52 was our strategic strength recognized around the globe. Yet Vietnamese forces showed that B-52s could be rendered nearly useless. Each night, they dug trenches and crept close to U.S. positions to engage in brutal close-quarters combat, neutralizing the bombers' effectiveness. That forced the U.S. to lower B-52 bombing altitude from around 10,000 boulders to about 9,000 Ballwinter to improve accuracy. But those shifts meant bombs sometimes landed as close as 100 meters from U.S. bases, risking friendly fire and shocking losses. Then came a surprise on January 28th. South Vietnamese intelligence discovered broadcasts and leaflets calling for general uprising in urban areas. They realized our strategy was to strike the urban command centers during Tet. Ironically, on January 30th, just one day before our general attack, they broadcast appeals urging soldiers to return to units. But most didn't, preferring to stay with family during the Lunar New Year. Many said even if they wanted to return, transport was disrupted due to holiday travel. Because of that, major enemy strongholds in Saigon, U.S. Embassy, Independence Palace, Dinh Ngoc Lap, the radio station, and the police headquarters were attacked and overrun with ease. This series of attacks shocked America. Later, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger described Hanoi's strategy as baiting America into focusing on periphery battles, then striking U.S.-held urban centers from within. The surprise was devastating. A particularly shocking moment occurred when Nguyen Ngoc Loan, a South Vietnamese general, executed a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street, a graphic image that stunned the world. Even after immigration to the U.S., protests erupted. Democratic lawmakers Elizabeth Holtzman and Harold Washington filed a hearing to have Loan tried as a war criminal. But the U.S. government, reluctant to dredge up its involvement, allowed Loan to remain in the U.S., where he ran a pizza parlor in Virginia. Activists visited and spray-painted messages like, "We know who you are," fueling global anti-war sentiment. In Saigon, U.S. command centers were temporarily occupied for hours. American soldiers at Khe Sanh found themselves in what felt like hell. Morale plummeted. They realized death was no longer distant. Historian Michael McClear later wrote that the evening news at 6 p.m. brought the war into every American living room. It felt like madness, not freedom, and framed an aging leadership increasingly out of touch. That sea change in public perception, the shock of the Tet Offensive and the loss of morale, forced the U.S. Army and our political leadership to the negotiating table, with Paris peace talks lasting 4 years, 8 months, and 16 days, featuring the verbal duel between Kissinger and Duc Tho. That shift would change everything. Picking up where we left off, the shock of the Tet Offensive changed the course of the Vietnam War. For the American public, the impact was immediate and deeply personal. As our command centers in Saigon were struck and images of chaos and brutality flashed across TV screens, a sense of vulnerability spread throughout the country. American families began to see the conflict not as a distant operation, but as a battle that was entering their own living rooms every evening, shaking confidence in our military and government leadership. American soldiers at Khe Sanh found themselves isolated, morale shattered by the surprise attacks on Saigon and other urban centers. They began to see Khe Sanh not as a strategic stronghold, but as a hell on earth. The psychological pressure was immense. Soldiers knew that death could come at any moment, and the intensity of close quarters fighting made the experience all the more harrowing. Even with our overwhelming firepower and logistical superiority, 600 tons of supplies daily, B-52 bombers unleashing 100,000 tons of bombs, and artillery barrages unmatched in previous conflicts, the enemy's tactics of trench warfare, close-in assaults, and relentless night raids continued to nullify our technological advantages. Lowering the B-52s for better accuracy only increased the risk for our own troops, and friendly fire incidents became a grim reality. The North Vietnamese strategy of grabbing the enemy's belt to fight was proving devastatingly effective. The Tet Offensive also sent shockwaves through America's political circles. The surprise, the brutality, and the skillful timing. Attacking during Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, left both military and intelligence leaders scrambling for answers. Hanoi's plan to bait us into focusing on conventional battles at the periphery, only to launch surprise attacks in the cities, forced a painful reassessment of our own intelligence and strategic assumptions. One incident in particular became an international symbol of the war's brutality: the execution of a captured Viet Cong fighter by General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, right in the middle of a Saigon street. The photo of that moment became world famous, sparking outrage and deepening anti-war sentiment both in America and around the globe. Decades later, Loan immigrated to the U.S., but activists and even members of Congress protested his presence. Some even demanded his deportation as a war criminal. The echoes of that event, and the wider violence of the Tet Offensive, fueled protests from Virginia all the way to Washington, D.C. Back in Vietnam, the offensive led to the temporary occupation of American strongholds in Saigon and elsewhere. For hours, the heart of U.S. operations was in enemy hands. The sense of invincibility was gone, replaced by uncertainty and fear. The historian Michael McClear described how the 6 o'clock news had turned into a new front in the war. One fought in America's homes, where parents, spouses, and children confronted the cost of the conflict night after night. This relentless pressure, military, psychological, and political, forced the United States to the negotiating table. Paris became the site of a new kind of warfare, a battle of wits and words between Henry Kissinger and Duc Tho. The negotiations would drag on for more than 4 years, testing the resolve of both sides. International observers famously remarked, "Heaven created Kissinger, but why did it also create Duc Tho?" The world watched as each round of talks brought hope, disappointment, and renewed uncertainty. The story of the Tet Offensive and its aftermath is one of shock, adaptation, and a hard reckoning with the realities of war. For the United States, it marked a turning point, not just in military strategy, but in national consciousness and public opinion. The psychological blow was so deep that it altered the trajectory of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, setting the stage for the long, painful negotiations that followed. But how did the U.S. finally come to terms with this new kind of warfare? And what lessons did we learn from the grueling negotiations in Paris? What ultimately led to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords? And how did these events shape America's future role in global affairs? After the Tet Offensive, America had to consider a diplomatic approach. We sat across from the North Vietnamese, who were led by the legendary diplomat Duc Tho, a man who had become world famous for his negotiation skills, even winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in these talks. To understand how these negotiations unfolded, we need to look at why Paris became the chosen battleground for words instead of weapons. Both sides knew that the location of the talks would play a huge role in the outcome. The United Nations stepped in as an intermediary, suggesting Paris from the start. But we as Americans actually preferred Geneva, Switzerland, an old friend and ally and a neutral ground. North Vietnam, on the other hand, pushed for Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Their reasoning? It was friendly territory, making it easier to gather intelligence and possibly influence the outcome. Back and forth it went. Dozens of proposed venues, none accepted by both sides. Finally, the UN stepped in, and Paris was chosen. For us, Paris was hardly unfamiliar. France had a long history with Vietnam, and we had invested heavily in France's post-war recovery. Besides, Paris was a global center, buzzing with diplomats and reporters. In our minds, negotiations there would be transparent, and whatever was discussed would quickly be known around the world. We thought that was to our advantage, but that confidence was, in a way, our first big mistake. We underestimated North Vietnam. We thought of ourselves as the experienced, wealthy power, going up against what we considered a much poorer nation, unfamiliar with high-stakes international negotiation. But the North Vietnamese were far from naive. They had many friends in France, political parties, youth movements, even major women's organizations. At that time, France had one of the world's most powerful leftist movements, all of which openly supported Vietnam. We spent months just choosing a location, but that was only the beginning. Next came the table, literally. Should it be rectangular or square? The answer mattered because it defined who was at the table and in what capacity. America wanted a two-sided rectangular table. Us on one side, North Vietnam on the other. North Vietnam argued that, since the negotiations were about ending the war in all of Vietnam, it should be four-sided, so both the National Liberation Front, NLF, and the Republic of Vietnam could participate. In the end, after heated arguments, we ended up with a round table. No head of the table, no sides. That might seem like a small detail, but in negotiations, symbolism is everything. And North Vietnam knew it. But the subtleties of the negotiation didn't stop with the shape of the table. For us Americans, it was a frustrating experience. North Vietnam challenged nearly every detail, from where people would sit, to what names would appear on the placards, to who could even be in the room. It became obvious that these weren't just trivial preferences. Each demand was a move in a complex chess match, designed to create leverage and shape global perceptions of legitimacy. One of North Vietnam's most strategic moves was pushing for a four-party format. From our perspective, the North was trying to elevate the National Liberation Front, the NLF or Viet Cong, to the same status as our ally, the Republic of Vietnam. We pushed back hard, fearing this would legitimize the NLF's claims. North Vietnam, however, argued that if the goal was a comprehensive peace, every relevant side needed to be heard. The table became round, and with that, the four parties sat together, symbolizing, at least visually, that no one side was above the others. Another critical point for us was the involvement of outside powers. North Vietnam was adamant that China and the Soviet Union stay away from the talks, and honestly, we understood their logic. They'd already experienced being outnumbered at Geneva years before, surrounded by superpowers with their own agendas. This time, they wanted to sit as equals with America, with no other giants in the room. Ironically, this also suited us because we preferred direct negotiation to a circus of outside interference. As the talks wore on, these battles of protocol and symbolism dragged out for months. The American side, led by Henry Kissinger, felt the frustration. Each session seemed to focus less on peace and more on technicalities. But to North Vietnam, every detail was a test of will, a sign of who would yield first and who would set the narrative for the world to see. This attention to detail is more than just historical trivia. It's a negotiation lesson. Even in everyday life, the position you take, the place you choose, and the way you frame a conversation can make all the difference. Just like a date where you sit at dinner or the activities you suggest can say a lot about who you are and what you want, so too does every detail at the negotiating table. If you're facing your date across the table, there's competition. But if you sit side by side, you're showing partnership. The same was true in Paris. By moving from a confrontational arrangement to a cooperative one, the talk started to shift ever so slightly toward compromise. As the Paris peace talks went on, American negotiators realized they weren't dealing with amateurs. The North Vietnamese, especially Le Duc Tho, showed a mastery of negotiation that surprised even seasoned American diplomats. It was no longer about who was stronger on the battlefield, but who could hold their ground across from the other at the table. In the spring of 1968, North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, an unexpected major assault across South Vietnam that shocked the world and deeply affected U.S. strategy and politics. As Americans, we tend to focus on our military reaction during Tet. But equally significant was how our government, through our diplomats and military leaders, began considering peace negotiations in a new light. Simultaneously, North Vietnam designated Le Duc Tho, a seasoned veteran of resistance and a top official in the Communist Party, to lead their diplomatic efforts. Although not yet in Paris initially, he was quickly reassigned to oversee negotiations with us. In fact, after the Tet Offensive, Ho Chi Minh and the party Central Politburo appointed Tho to head their delegation in Paris. Tho, who had survived years of imprisonment under French colonial rule and earned the nickname the Hammer for his discipline and toughness, was seen by North Vietnam as the formidable strategist they needed. Our side was led by Henry Kissinger, national security advisor to President Nixon. Kissinger began secret talks with Tho in early 1970 to break years of deadlock. The first meeting between Kissinger and Tho occurred on February 21, 1970, in Paris. Though Xuan Thuy was the official head of the North Vietnamese delegation, it was Tho who took the real lead in negotiations. Kissinger described Tho as calm and dignified, always dressed in gray or maroon, with a smart and unyielding presence. At their talks, Tho insisted on an immediate and unconditional halt to all bombing of North Vietnam before any discussion on South Vietnam's political future could begin. He eventually accepted that South Vietnam might continue as a separate entity, but only if the National Liberation Front, NLF, was guaranteed representation in its government. Despite our side's expectations, Tho remained firm and undisguisedly skeptical of our intentions. Throughout 1970-1972, Kissinger and Tho held dozens of secret sessions. Kissinger often sought to modify previous agreements to accommodate the South Vietnamese government led by President Thieu. Tho resisted strongly, accusing us of bad faith negotiations and rejecting last-minute changes. He argued that North Vietnam would not accept proposals that undermined previous understandings, especially regarding prisoner exchange and troop withdrawal timelines. Then, in December 1972, after months of stalled progress, the U.S. launched heavy Christmas bombings over Hanoi and Haiphong to pressure Hanoi back to the table. But it proved futile. Tho refused to yield, and by January 1973, negotiations resumed on original terms. The eventual agreement, signed on January 23, 1973, mirrored the October draft that Tho had insisted on. It included a ceasefire, withdrawal of U.S. troops, prisoner exchanges, elections in South Vietnam, and the right for North Vietnamese forces to remain in the South. When the Nobel Peace Prize Committee awarded the prize jointly to Tho and Kissinger in 1973, Tho refused it, declaring that peace had not truly been established. He believed America and the South Vietnamese regime had violated the agreement, and that awarding peace to both aggressor and defender was unacceptable. At this transition point, we shift from high-stakes diplomacy to what comes next: the collapse of South Vietnam in 1975 and the final chapter in the long struggle. Picking up where we left off after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, Americans watched with cautious optimism as our last combat troops began to withdraw from Vietnam. There was a sense among many in the U.S. that finally our long, costly involvement was ending. However, the truth on the ground was much more complicated. Despite the ceasefire, fighting between North and South Vietnamese forces continued almost immediately. The South Vietnamese Army, known as ARVN, was left to defend the country with only limited U.S. support. Congress, responding to growing war fatigue at home, sharply reduced aid to South Vietnam. Meanwhile, the North, led by determined leaders like Duc Tho, continued to build up their strength and prepare for a new offensive. During this period, Tho was a key figure in coordinating political and military strategies from Hanoi. While our diplomats and military advisors hoped that the balance of power would hold, North Vietnam maintained extensive supply routes, including the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail, running through Laos and Cambodia. American intelligence repeatedly reported large-scale movement of men and material southward, but with U.S. forces gone, options were limited. Throughout 1974, the South Vietnamese government, under President Thieu, struggled with declining morale, corruption, and economic crisis. The promise of the Paris Agreement, that the people of South Vietnam would decide their own political future, began to seem impossible. By late 1974, North Vietnamese forces had positioned themselves for a decisive campaign. In March 1975, North Vietnam launched the Spring Offensive, a massive coordinated assault against South Vietnam. City after city fell at a staggering speed. Despite years of U.S. investment and training, the ARVN could not hold the line. The collapse was sudden and, for many Americans watching on television, utterly shocking. In just 55 days, North Vietnamese forces captured key provincial capitals, broke ARVN defenses, and advanced rapidly toward Saigon. Duc Tho remained at the heart of Hanoi's leadership, overseeing both the political messaging and the overall strategy. He and his colleagues framed the campaign as a final push for national reunification, rallying their forces with a mix of revolutionary fervor and careful planning. In April 1975, as North Vietnamese tanks rolled toward Saigon, the world witnessed chaotic scenes of evacuation, helicopters lifting Americans and Vietnamese allies from rooftops, desperate crowds at the gates of the U.S. Embassy. These iconic images marked not only the end of America's involvement, but also the dramatic close of a decades-long conflict. On April 30, 1975, Saigon fell. The Republic of Vietnam, the South, ceased to exist. The North's victory was complete, and soon after, Vietnam was officially unified under communist rule. For the United States, this outcome was a bitter reckoning. The human, financial, and political costs were enormous, and for years to come, America would grapple with the lessons of the Vietnam War. For Duc Tho, victory was the ultimate validation of his life's work. Yet, even in triumph, the legacy of the war, devastation, loss, and profound division would shape both nations for generations. So, what can we really learn from this epic diplomatic and military struggle? How did the American and Vietnamese people come to terms with such a complex, painful legacy? And what lessons do these events hold for conflicts today? We'll explore these questions in our next episode. Don't forget to subscribe to History Discussion and hit the bell icon so you won't miss our deep dive into the aftermath of the Vietnam War and its enduring impact. See you next time.